Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. Today we're going to talk about Math and Bioshock. One, two, infinite. So we're going to talk about the Bioshock series, its awesomeness, and how math is used along the way in the gameplay, in the more meta sense, and within the universe. Um, so yeah, I'm going to try to avoid major plot details because I feel like they're better left experienced, and I wanted to focus more on the gameplay anyway, among other things. But I do want to talk about some things, right? So you're free to assume spoilers ahead, and feel free to assume like all the spoilers just to be safe. Because I am going to talk about some things, characters, and maybe some plot elements, but I wanted to give fair warning with that, right? So if you're going to go ahead, assume that there will be spoilers, all the spoilers. Let's get into it. So my focal point will be around the combat, at least at first, and then kind of diving in deeper, and just giving kind of an overview of things. And I think I'm gonna have some fun with this. I hope you do too. So the gameplay does vary a little bit game to game, but at its core, it has a strong core, and that core remains the same with some tweaks, some different iterations, all that good stuff, right? Um, so the basics of the gameplay is, it's a first-person shooter with RPG elements, or a, first-person shooter slash RPG, whatever you want to call it. Either way, the idea is it's very combat heavy, among other things, right? And there's a lot of customization, right? Customization in the weapons you use, customization in your different abilities and focal points, i.e., there are ways to improve your combat skills and your engineering skills as you progress. So there are different ways to suit your game play style. Um, and, it's all math. To go back to the combat as a whole, the idea is, you're accruing different weapons. You got your long range attacks and your melee attacks. Throughout Bioshock, the melee weapons have their core purpose, but then vary, game to game. Because, like in the first one, right, you have a wrench, and then the second one, you have a drill, and that drill you can use like you would the wrench as a blunt instrument, but you could also drill, and you have fuel for that, right? And then like for the third game, like Infinite, you have the Skyhook, which there's some basic attacks too, but you could also use it as a finisher. You could also use it as a mode of transportation and also attacking people from and to there. That could have been said better, but we'll get into that a little later. But in all these cases, right, like there's math. And I think that's cool, right? Because there's math in these attacks when to use them, right? Because with melee attacks, you're using them close range, or like the skyhook, you can use that to kind of close the gap, so to speak. And how much damage they do, and when you should use them. There's something that they're inherently mathematical, and like how you design that with the use of long range weapons and other elements of the game, right? I mean, with the long range weapons, they function differently too, because you might have a pistol, but that functions differently than a shotgun, right? So you have the weapons and how they function and flow, but you also have the ammo to consider, right? And when to preserve them. So with combat, you have a couple things going, right? You're always in motion, and then you have the different weapons. You have your long range, you have your short range. You also have the idea of plasmids in like one and two, or vigors in infinite. And the idea about both of those cases is that you have superpowers. It could be telekinesis, could be pyrokinesis, could be electrokinesis, whatever the case may be. These plasmids, these vigors, they function and flow differently too. They can be powered up as well. Um, and you have the atom. Sorry, you have atom, which you could use to power your plasmids, and like Eve to actually use them, or salts in infinite. But the whole thing is like there's math in all those too, right? Because there's math in getting the plasmids slash vigors, and how there's math in how they function and how they flow, how you use them in battle, and how you stay fueled. And throughout the game, you have this idea of resource management, right? Resource management in terms of your weapons and your plasmids slash vigors, but also just like currency and health and all that stuff. So there's a lot going on there. And I think that's really cool because we don't always think about it, but it's math, right? Because the idea is like, right, you are dishing out damage while trying to not take it. You're using things like the long range combat, short range combat, plasma slash vigors, and you're moving around while you do. You're practicing resource management inside and outside of battle. You're moving around the environment, right? You're monitoring things like the distance between you and your foe and assessing what weapon you should use. And not only do you have the, basic situation like that, but, there's other situations that pop up, but, you're taking into account your environment. You're taking into account the motion of yourself, of your enemies, of what you have at your disposal, right? Because, you have your weapons and you might be going through your ammo, so you have to conserve that and use that accordingly. And with the plasmas and vigor, the idea is the same, right? You can only use them to a limited degree. So you're paying attention to everything and deciding, hey, this is what I'm going to do in this situation. And then to extend the concept, like you have different puzzles that you encounter throughout the game, different ways to navigate the environment, different safes that you can unlock with different codes, and there are different mini games to handle that too. And there's math and all of that as well. And then just the environment, right? Math and how it functions, how it flows, how you move about it, how enemies pop up, and how you use that all in combat as well as navigation. And then it's like in all of these games, you have these different environments and you have the narrative and ways to push forward. All of that had to be designed, all of that had to be programmed, and you yourself, you're navigating everything, you're puzzle solving, you're going through combat, you're figuring everything out, and it's all math. It's all very calculated. And I think that's cool. It's like we don't always think about that, but it's all very designed. Like nothing's just happening just because, right? And so you might not see everything written out, but the math is there, right? And then to add to all of that, like I said, or did I say it in this video? I don't know, but Bioshock is a very STEM heavy series. I might not have said it. Bioshock is a very STEM heavy series, and I mean that in the sense that they openly talk about that, right? Because it's a longer conversation for another day, but you can't really divorce STEM and art. And Bioshock is actually that whole series is an interesting example of that, right? Because math and gaming go hand in hand, and gaming is such a perfect union of math and art. But I wanted to mention like STEM in the traditional sense because, right, there's a lot of discussion about math and science in all three games, right? And you can see a lot of math on the board and hear a lot of discussions about that. And I like that in the second game, uh, there's a character called Eleanor, and uh, in her room, like when she was younger, you could see her solving system of equations, or you could see the results of her doing that. And I thought that was pretty cool. Um, but whether we're talking about one, two, or infinite, math is all over the place. And then I think the cool thing with infinite is they kind of go really hard with it because they talk about quantum mechanics a lot and probability and like all these different worlds and the idea of constants and variables. Like similarities and differences in each of these worlds, and they just kind of really get in there. And I think that's cool. Yeah, so there's math throughout the gameplay in numerous ways, whether we're talking about the combat, the choices you make in combat, powering up your characters and your play style, navigating the environment itself. Everything has been designed, everything's been calculated and programmed, and all that took time to do. There is math across the board, and not to mention in the marketing and the budget, and porting these games out to different systems. So there's so much math and just everything I just said in more. In this video, it's like I feel like if I'm not careful, I'll get carried away with it. And not always in the way that I want with these sort of things. So it's like um, I wanted to talk about the games and how I feel about each of them. Um, so yeah, I really dig the fact that math is kind of in your face with it, and I dig that. But if we're gonna talk about the individual games, like I set spoilers ahead in the beginning, so you can assume that going forward, just to be safe. So you can make an informed decision whether to continue or not. But so with Bioshock, the classic is not the one I played first. I played Infinite first. Um, but I've played all three. And so with Bioshock, does it live up to the hype? Yes. I'm gonna say yes. Like, because here's the thing, like, I say it more for the gameplay than the story, because to be fair, I knew one of the major twists going in. Not so much the other one, but one twist I knew, but it was admittedly impressive, in a sense, right? But then there's one that it dealt with an identity thing. If you know, you know, and I don't know how everyone feels about it, but I thought that part was lame. But one of the twists is like, okay, that's fair. But more than that, like I'm impressed by the gameplay because, like like I said, I played Infinite first, right? Like back in the day, and then I eventually got around to one, two, and like replaying Infinite. And with one, it was just like crazy how strong the gameplay was. They knew what they wanted it to do. They designed a combat system how they wanted to design it to give, it's like this solid sense of what it is while allowing you to customize things, right? Because it's like you could focus more on the combat and power things up in a sense with that, right? Or you could focus more on your engineering skills and make it easier to solve like different puzzles, among other things, right? But you have that customization, and you have a bunch of weapons, you have a bunch of plasmids, and right, you can't use all the weapons at once. You can't use all the plasmids at once. You have to decide what you're gonna do in any given situation. There's a lot of customization, and I can respect that. And if you've played all three games, you'll notice that Bioshock at its core is the same. There's been some changes game to game, and I'd argue Infinite really took it up another notch. But at its core, it was already very strong, and I appreciate that and what they did. And I think overall the story is pretty solid. Again, like I knew one of the plot points, or sorry, one of the big twists, and I liked one of them. But then the other one, I'm like, eh. But overall, it's like I get why people like it. It's a great game. Now that was Bioshock one, right? Well, Bioshock two, I'd argue. Hear me out on this. I'd argue, not that it's better than one, and not that it's better than Infinite, because Infinite is my favorite one for the record. But I'd argue that two is a great game as well. And maybe it doesn't shine as hard as the other ones, but it still shines. And I'd never hear it get brought up, which is unfortunate. So with two, I liked that they did something a little different, a little bit weird, because that's the one where you're playing as a big daddy, which feels weird to say. But you get my point, right? It's like you play as one of the big daddies, and it's like it's different, and they did some fascinating things with the plot because I feel like with each of the Bioshock games, right, you can identify like a theme or a group of themes, um, and I feel like it's fascinating to me because like with the first Bioshock, you definitely had that theme of like objectivism, uh, running throughout it. And ultimately, to me, it says like, well, objectivism isn't great. But I felt like with the second one, is like you have that idea of like collectivism or utilitarianism, different elements of those, and it's like it's kind of saying those things aren't great. And then the second one is just like you got nationalism and saying that that's not great and that racism's not great. And so I feel like there's a lot of themes in these games where it's like they have these like different moral and philosophical themes where a lot of times it's like, hey, these aren't actually great. So I can appreciate that. And in the second one, I think it had a decent story and a different, decent approach to it. But I think one of the things that makes it suffer is like one, probably like I mean, people just haven't probably played it much because the first one in Infinite gets so much credit, and rightfully so. But I mean, for the credit part. Um, but I think they don't always. Sorry, I think like with two, um, people don't always know much about it, and that's a big factor. Because again, like I think the story was decent, the gameplay was decent, and they added some new things. But I think one of the things that hurts it is like so with the first game, right? It takes place in Rapture, and Infinite takes place in Colombia. Um, but the second one also takes place in Rapture. It is very very similar looking. That cannot help it. So I think those are some factors why people like either haven't played it, or maybe are not as impressed about it, but it's pretty solid. But then, you have Infinite. BioShock Infinite. Whew, that game. First and foremost, Elizabeth is an awesome character. And I think that game just excels. So it's like, it took the core gameplay that, you see in Bioshock 1 and 2, and then it adds some different things. Like I mentioned the skyhook like earlier, you use that as a weapon, but also as transportation throughout the game. And as a weapon, you have your basic attacks, but then you also can use it as a finisher. You can use it to attack people that are on the line. You can use that to attack people from the line, and it's just an awesome like weapon and transportation device. And it's fun, it's visually stunning, and I think what's really cool is like there's some DLC, the Burial at Sea content, and that connects it even better to Bioshock 1 and 2, because it's like you could see why it's a Bioshock game if you played it, right? It makes sense. Well, the setting is very different, but Burial at Sea episodes 1 and 2, they connect everything a bit better. And I think that's awesome. And I just had a fun game with it. And like I said, with Bioshock, they're not shy about like talking about math, and they're not shy talking about science. And there was a lot that was discussed in Infinite about quantum mechanics, and I think that's awesome. And it's just like it's such a fun game, and it hits you hard. They want just all the way hard with it, and so it's like I think one, two, and Infinite are all great games. Bioshock is an excellent series, but it's like Bioshock Infinite was my favorite, right? And it's a lot of other people's favorite, and then like Bioshock is a lot of people's favorites. But I've never heard anyone say two is their favorite, and that's a shame because again, they're all great games. But Infinite is where I started, and I would eventually get around to doing like one and two, and then replaying Infinite. And when I did all those, it was back to back because I got like Bioshock Collection, which is a great way to play all three. Um, and I got it on a sale, which is awesome. What you do with your money and time is also mathematical for the record. But yeah, so Bioshock is an excellent series. I thoroughly enjoyed playing through all of those games and also getting to do that back to back. It's great. So, if you've played Bioshock and you just want to talk about it or talk about things that you notice mathematically about it, please feel free to do so. I'll see you in the future. Professor Prime out.